Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist of comics like American-Born Chinese, Boxers and Saints, and the upcoming Dragon Hoops. It's Gene Luen Yang. Thanks for coming on, Gene.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
So, normally when people come on for the first time, I like to go back a little bit before the work that we're talking about. And I wanted to start with you because you share something with me, and that's the fact that you remember the first comic you read, like the comic that really made you love comics. And that was DC Comics Presents number 57, which was starring Superman and the Atomic Knights. It was love at first read. As near as I can tell, I mean, everything you said in interviews, you basically knew you wanted to make comics as soon as you read one. So, going back, obviously it's a little difficult to put yourself in the shoes of, tiny Gene. What was it that spoke to you about that comic and continues to speak to you about comics in general?
Yeah, DC Comics Presents number 57 was the very first comic in my collection. I was not super happy about getting it. I had actually wanted this Marvel 2-in-1 starring The Thing and Rom, the Space Knight. But my mom bought me the DC comic because it had Superman in it, and Superman seemed like a safe superhero. He's like the best behaved superhero out of all the heroes out there. But I brought it home and I read it, and that story, I don't remember a ton about it,
Yeah.
But I just remember my emotions after reading it. I think I was kind of scared. It was about the atomic bomb. And I was also kind of amazed. It was about all these, the Atomic Knights are these guys who wear medieval style armor and they ride around on these giant mutated dogs. And there was something really crazy and fascinating about that. And even Superman was kind of cool, dude who could fly and who was super strong. I was shocked at how that book could tell a story, like an effective emotional story, using drawings on a page. And I've been drawing since I was a little kid. So that was the very first time that I realized drawings didn't have to move to get an emotional reaction out of you. Up until that point, I'd wanted to be a Disney animator. Like, that was my big dream. When I was really little, like third grade, our teacher made us do these biography reports, and I chose to do mine on Walt Disney. After that, I really, really wanted to be a Disney animator. But that kind of switched after that particular comic book issue. That's when I realized, I could start telling stories through pictures immediately. Nowadays, if a kid wants to be an animator, they totally can, right? You can just get on a computer and go. But back in the 80s when I was growing up, that wasn't true. But with comics, ever since the beginning of the medium, anybody could make comics. All you really needed was something to draw with, something to draw on, and some time. So that's when I started making comics. It was like a couple weeks after getting that DC Comics Presents.
That is a very, very fortuitous. I mean, it's interesting how those comics, those first comics you read, create such a lasting impression. I mean, I've talked about this in my podcast a lot, but the first comic I really remember reading is the Transformers number 41 from the Marvel series. And the thing I really loved about it was there was this page in it that showed all of these Autobots and Decepticons fighting each other on the moon. And I was already a huge fan of Transformers at that point, but in the back they had a synopsis of who all those characters were on that page fighting, and the way it was delivering information, and the way that it was I don't know, it just, there was so much going on. I was like, how is this possible? How can they do this in one page? And it was immediately love at first sight. And it is kind of funny how those types of things, it's you can't really remember that story really well, but you remember enough, it was enough to make you fall in love with the medium, really.
Yeah, that's right. I was a huge fan of those Transformers comics too. I think I had a copy of Transformers number 1.
Oh, wow.
And I remember a spread that was similar to that. They were standing around in the Ark, their base. It was a bunch of Autobots, and there was a little label next to each Autobot saying who they were.
Yeah.
I remember something like that. It was really cool. Yeah, it's that's exactly right. There's no way to deliver that amount of information in a time-bound medium like animation or like film.
Right. Well, do you, combining your interest in animation when you were before comics and then being interested in making comics and eventually making comics, I do think that one thing that overlaps between those things. And obviously you weren't thinking of this when you were a child, but do you think the root of it is you were kind of always interested in telling stories above all? Like that was something you wanted to do?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I grew up in a house full of stories. My parents were both storytellers. They're both immigrants. My mom was born in mainland China, and my dad in Taiwan. And I think this is true of a lot of immigrant parents. You know, they tell their kids stories from the culture that they left as a way of keeping that connection alive. So I grew up
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of Chinese stories, and I think even if I didn't understand it with my brain, I understood it with my heart. Like there was something important about storytelling. There was something preserving about storytelling.
This is might be a reach, but I always thought it was interesting. You spent 17 years teaching at coding, and then you also worked as a coder for 2 years, I believe. And this might be incongruous, but I feel like to a certain degree, there's a certain amount of logic to coding that almost feels like storytelling in a weird way. It's like it all has to add up in the end for it all to work. And it's like it's not a narrative in the traditional sense, but I kind of feel like your past, working as a teacher but also as a coder, there's like it kind of fits your storytelling brain in a weird way. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into that.
No, I think that's totally true. I think that's totally true. I tell people this all the time. I did a series called Secret Coders, which is a graphic novel series that teaches middle grade kids how to code. And I've had the chance to go to these different elementary schools and middle schools to talk about the importance of coding. And that's what I tell them. I tell them, no matter what you want to do in life, coding is actually going to help you because coding is a way of thinking. It's not really typing stuff into a computer. It's really training your brain how to think. And specifically for comics, for storytelling within comics, coding requires you to take these abstract ideas and break them into concrete pieces, like smaller, understandable concrete pieces. And then you got to put these pieces in sequence. And that's exactly what you're doing when you're making comics as well. You take this vague idea, like you have a vague idea of maybe where the story's going to go, maybe who's involved in the story. And eventually you got to break them down into concrete pieces in the form of panels on a page,
Mm-hmm.
You got to put these panels in sequence so that people can understand. So I think that's totally valid. Coding and storytelling, I feel, use the same parts of my brain.
Do you think I read that you were a big outliner. Do you think that's part of the reason why you're such an outliner is your brain just kind of, in a way, craves structure?
Yeah, that might be true. I mean, I didn't start off as an outliner. The first couple of comics I did, I just kind of made up as I went along, and
Mm.
it was really frustrating. I would get into these corners, and I would have no way to get out. I would have no idea how to get my characters out of these corners. But after I started outlining, that problem stopped. I know that's not true for everybody, though. I've heard that Larry Hama, the legendary G.I. Joe writer, he would actually do that on purpose. He would actually purposely drive his characters into a corner that he couldn't immediately see and escape from. And then by the next issue, he'll have figured out an escape.
I had Mark Waid on the podcast recently, and we had a conversation about the same thing. He loves putting his characters into a corner, and he's like, then I just have to figure out how to get them out. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that takes a very specific type of brain that I don't know if I could do. I mean, I like problem solving, but I also like having a structure to lean up against to make that problem solving a little bit easier.
Yeah, I don't think I'm like Mark Waid at all. I love his stuff. Irredeemable is one of my favorites,
Yeah.
but my brain just doesn't work that way. I think when I get my characters into a corner that I can't seem to get out of, I just feel freaked out. My brain freezes.
Yeah, that's a good thing to avoid. But, well, I wanted to ask about, for storytellers, one of the things that people often ask them is just like, well, how do you come up with your stories? And that's kind of what I'm wondering about, like the inspiration that that you need to find your stories. But is that something you're actively pursuant of, typically trying to find that inspiration? Or is it really just kind of keeping your eyes open in your brain, willing to accept potential stories when you're looking for the right opportunities? Is it more like you're going out to find it, or is it just things that come in and then it forms from there?
Yeah, I think it depends. It depends on kind of what season I'm in. Like if I'm knee deep in another project, I'm generally not looking for other stories to tell, and sometimes they'll just find their way into my brain or into my life in some way. And then when I'm winding down a project, I'll be actively looking for stories. I'll be looking through, the ones that occurred to me while I was in the middle of the project that I'm about to finish. But I don't know if I have just one way of finding a story. And I think that's true for most authors too, right? Like for most authors, sometimes you gotta actively go and wrestle one down, and sometimes they'll find you.
Yeah. I mean, that's the funny thing is people always tell me like where their ideas come from or where they're at when they come from. It's always like weird places like, oh, I was in the shower and I came up with this idea, or I was mowing the lawn. And it's, inspiration can come from anywhere and from at any time. I mean, a perfect example is Dragon Hoops, the book we're here to talk about. I mean, you were decidedly not a basketball fan. I mean, I imagine that, back in the American Born Chinese and Boxers and Saints days, you probably were, if somebody suggested to you that in the future you would make a comic about basketball, you'd probably be like, well, you're crazy. I don't know about that.
Yeah, that's right. I never would have thought I'd be, I spent 5 years of my life writing and drawing a book about basketball. I never would have thought I would have done that. I was so not a basketball fan
Yeah.
up until doing that book. Yeah.
Well, I do have to comment before I get into Dragon Hoops in full. I do think it's really funny. So when I first cracked this book open, I was sitting on my couch and I had a basketball game on silent just because it was, I love basketball and it just kind of was one of those things that I do. And I opened the book as I like check the score and I look at the first panel. It says, I've hated sports ever since I was a little kid, especially basketball. And I was just like, oh my God, what am I getting myself into? This is such a funny combination of events.
That's funny. That's funny. But that's totally true. I've hated basketball since I was a little kid. It was like the basketball court was always this arena of humiliation for me because I was just terrible at it.
Sure. Yeah. No, and that's the thing is just I grew up being good at sports. Just like I was always pretty good at sports and I always played basketball and stuff. But there was one thing that I was bad at always. I was horrible at foosball. And whenever my friends would be like, "Oh, do you want to play foosball?" I'm like, "Foosball is terrible. Who wants to play that game?" But in secret, it was just I'm really bad at this. And like, I'm not saying that was the case for you, but it's just there's always things that like. It's funny how you don't think you like something until you kind of like something unlocks it for you. But
yeah. No, that was totally the case for me. That was totally exactly the same. Foosball for you was basketball.
Well, I'm going to do a quick spiel about Dragon Hoops. Dragon Hoops is the story of Gene following the Bishop O'Dowd Dragons. Bishop O'Dowd being the high school that you taught at, and the Bishop O'Dowd Dragons was the basketball team of that high school. As they you followed them as they made their push to win their first California state championships, or will they? Have to read the book to find out. It's both a look at the team and Gene as he learns about the narrative power of sports, despite not previously being a fan, but also really like what you learn about yourself during it. That was one of the things that surprised me as I was reading it. As I was like, oh, this is just me following a basketball team as we go along. But you were such an active participant I didn't expect. But as I told you before we started recording, I loved it. I tweeted immediately afterwards. I was like, give this book all the Eisners. And I was not joking in any capacity because it is just an astonishing achievement. And, but like normally I would ask about how this story came together because like that's just a good starting point. But that's sort of the point of the story. And it could in a way be classified as a spoiler. So instead, I wanted to start with the development of the book, as it's one I'm very curious about. As I was saying, you weren't a fan of basketball. This wasn't something you were looking to tell. What was the process like for this book? Because it is so you're almost like a reporter during the year that you're with Bishop O'Dowd. Was it considerably different than your usual process because of your active relationship with the story?
Yeah. Well, thanks first for all those kind words. It's really gratifying to hear, especially after spending so long in front of my Wacom tablet to work on that book.
Oh yeah.
And this book, out of all the books that I've done, this is the one that freaks me out the most. First, because it's nonfiction. All the characters are real. They're all characters that are real people who I have relationships with. And this is the first time that I've ever done something nonfiction like this, where it is kind of like I'm a reporter. Like early on, one of the discussions that I had with my editor, Mark Siegel, who is an amazing award-winning graphic novelist in his own right. But we talked about whether or not I should actually be a character in the book. Mm-hmm. My initial instinct was to keep myself out of it because I wanted, I think I was just kind of looking for the quote-unquote objective viewpoint, right? I wanted to tell a quote-unquote objective story about this basketball team. But as I went on, I realized that just wasn't possible. Like I had to be real about where I was coming from, that I wasn't a basketball fan when I started on this project. So in an early draft, I had myself in the prologue and epilogue, but not anywhere in the middle. And that didn't really work either. Ultimately, somewhere along the way, I think Mark and some of the other folks that I was talking to made me realize that I had to kind of be in it all the way through as almost like the viewpoint for the viewer. In part, that's just to stay honest, about the perspective from which the story is told. Mm-hmm. I really think actually that kind of fits with one of my theories about comics. I think comics, one of the big strengths about comics is that it is an intimate medium, that if you do a comic right, it can almost feel like a diary, like you can get at that level of intimacy. So for me to attempt that, I had to put myself directly in the narrative.
Well, and I think that it becomes all the richer for it, because if it was just a book about basketball, and believe me, as anyone who has listened to this podcast can attest to, I'm always advocating for more sports comics, because there's a lot of sports manga. There's not a lot of sports comics in Western comics, at least in my experience. And so I would have been totally fine with that. But the fact that you were an active participant, and the fact that you had your own journey within the journey, and like, it seems like you kind of learned a lot about how you wanted to approach comics yourself, and also kind of your work-life balance within the story itself. Removing yourself from it would have, well, first off, it would have made for a weaker comic, but on top of that, it would have taken away from some of the impact of that journey. I don't know. I mean, I thought it was interesting, because when I first read the parts where you were talking to your editors at DC about working for Superman, I was like, oh, why is this in here? And then as it went along, I'm like, this is like an integral part of the story. It's all connected in a way that I wouldn't have expected going into it.
Yeah, it was a really weird year. When I started working on Dragon Hoops, when I started following the team, I did not know that would be my last year at that school. I didn't know that I would have to leave that school in order to take this crazy offer from DC Comics to write Superman. And all the way, like as I was following the team, I was actually struggling with that decision. Like DC called my editor to offer me this position, and I didn't take it immediately because I was kind of freaked out about it. So ultimately, those two things in my life actually did tie together. I felt like what I saw in court actually did influence my approach to that decision, and all of that kind of made me realize why people like basketball. even like I used to live with these 6 other guys in college, and every day at around like 9:50 p.m., no matter what we were doing, everybody would gather together in the living room and they would watch these sports highlights. Yeah. And I was the only one in the room being like, why are you guys doing this? This is so stupid. Like out of like in the news, the sports highlights are the one piece that doesn't really affect the world. I mean, that's what I thought at the time. And after following that team, I realized that's not actually true. Sports actually really has a huge effect on the world in the same way that I think movies do, right? The things that happen in movies are quote unquote real for the most part, unless you're watching a documentary, but they do absolutely have an effect on the real world because they affect the way we think, they affect the way we feel, and that translates into our real world actions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, related to that, you talked about in the book, you walk through your decision-making process, basically, or like the inspiration process for making Dragon Hoops. But in reality, it was a little bit more complex than that. It wasn't just you overheard some students. It was it was Linsanity. Jeremy Lin was blowing up at the time. It seemed like you were reading some related books. Did you resist basketball as a subject at all, even as you were researching? Were you like, I don't know, like, why would I want to dedicate years of my life to making this a book about a subject that I personally, as of now, do not care about? Like, was there
Yeah,
resistance within you?
it felt like basketball was staging an invasion into my life.
It was a
You know,
coup.
so first, yeah, first there were these amazing books, both comics and prose books. A book of narrative poetry called Crossover by Kwame Alexander won a bunch of awards. So I started reading all these books about basketball. And then my son joined his school team. He was in fifth grade at the time, so I started going to basketball games. And then Linsanity happened, and as an Asian American, I just found that whole phenomenon incredibly fascinating. So I started paying attention to basketball. So basketball, yeah, was sort of staging a coup inside my brain. And then the 2014-2015 school year starts, and on campus, all anyone can talk about is the basketball team, is the varsity men's team. So I think I was resistant for a while, but what really cinched it for me was that when I went and talked to the coach, Coach Lou Ritchie,
Hmm.
and I heard his story about when he was a player at the Showdown. And when he told me that story, when I first heard it, I was like, "You've got to be lying. That sounds like something out of a movie." But then he gives me the game tape, from 1998, and I go and watch it, and I realize it's real. That what he was telling me was the truth. And I was like, "Dude, I got to do this. I got to do this book. I got to see if he can finally pull it off."
It was the perfect storm, it seems.
Yeah, yeah. It was like basketball was forcing me to spend 5 years of my life telling a story about it.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. I want to take a quick second to give a shout out to my friends at TKO Studios. TKO is a new comics publisher doing things a little differently, with each of their titles being binge released in trade paperback and 6-issue collector's box sets at the same time. Their second wave of comics dropped recently, including one of my comics of the year in Jeff Lemire and Gabriel Hernandez Walta's Sentient, Roxane Gay and Ming Doyle's The Banks, and more, as well as gems from their first wave, like Garth Ennis and Steve Epting's remarkable war story, Sarah. Each is available now at tkopresents.com in trade, single-issue box sets, and digital release. Want to check these comics out before you order? Well, I have great news for you. If you visit tkopresents.com, you can read the first issues of each title for free right now. If you like what you read and you're a retailer, reach out directly to them at sales@tkopresents.com or go to tkopresents.com/vendors to order. TKO offers a 50% order discount as well as free shipping in the United States, a deal that's pretty hard to beat. Just a reader? That's cool too. You can order whichever comics you like directly off their site as well. Visit tkopresents.com to learn more today. And now, back to the show. Going into it as a big basketball fan, I never even considered the idea that I would see people that I was aware of within this story. But I mean, that was one of the interesting things when I got to the Bishop O'Dowd roster. I was like, Ivan Rabb was on this team. I mean, I remember reading about him because I'm a huge fan of the Indiana Pacers, and I remember internally debating. I'm like, do I want the Pacers to draft Ivan Rabb? And then I'm reading this book about him. I'm like, oh my god, I wish we drafted Ivan Rabb. But it was interesting because you have all these real people in it. It's Ivan Rabb, and then, I mean, obviously they're all real people, but there's like notable personas. Like there's this big game that Bishop O'Dowd plays against another national power, and it's against Ben Simmons, like former number one pick, guy who's going to be an all-star this year, part of one of the most divisive basketball teams in the NBA. Stanley Johnson was in there. Brian Shaw. I mean, Brian Shaw went to Bishop O'Dowd and was, if I remember correctly, he was was he a bench warmer? No, it wasn't. He was a bench warmer. He was a bench warmer
all the way through his senior year. That's why he went to UC Santa Barbara.
Right. Yeah. And then he went from a bench warmer at Bishop O'Dowd to like a multi NBA champion, which is astonishing.
That's right.
I mean, that's one of the things I think is really interesting is I'm sure to you as a storyteller, putting yourself in it was something that maybe you weren't skeptical about, but you were maybe a little nervous about. But on top of that, you had these very real people who you were representing and you were trying to bring to life. Was that something that you were very conscientious about, or was it more you just have to tell the story the best way you possibly can?
No, I was very conscientious about it because, these are people that I really care about. It's a community that I deeply love. I really love that school community. I've been away from them for for 5 years, but I still help. I still go and help out. I still go and volunteer there because I just love that community so much, and I wanted to. There was this. I thought there was a struggle. There was a struggle between truth and love. Like like do I need to hide certain parts of the truth because I love this community so much? And I think a lot of that was embodied by the situation with Coach Phelps, who was the coach of Coach Lue's team when he was a player there. So I think that was a tension all the way through. And there's also this tension about, sometimes, especially with teenage boys, they don't want to tell you everything. So what do you do in that case? Like, how do you tell a story about teenage boys when they don't want to tell you everything? And then what are the reasons for not wanting to tell you everything? Are they good reasons? So that was another struggle that I had.
I loved, I mean, this counts as a spoiler because it is towards the end of the book, but at the same time, it's not really, I feel, but you talked about how Ivan and Paris, like two of the best two players in the team, how it was kind of hard to get through to them because of, where they came from and how they didn't necessarily want to talk about that. And you compared them in the end to basically like, they were like, Superman and Clark Kent and Batman and Bruce Wayne, like those are like different personas. And like in some ways, I actually really think that that's one of the interesting things about athletes is like sometimes when you get them at their most pure, the most them, it's when they're on the court. It's when they feel the most comfortable, and it's when their greatness and their maximized self manifests itself. It's an interesting split that I don't think you normally see in terms of most fields of work, quote unquote.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that a lot of athletes, when they are on the court, they're giving you their all. That's what they want to give to the public. That's their gift, right, to the audience. And then they need their Clark Kent. They need a piece of themselves to remain private, just to stay sane. So I think early on when I, especially with Ivan, I think Ivan was pretty, I just knew from some of the stories that I heard from the coaches that he had gone through some hardships as a kid. He didn't. He grew up in a tougher part of Oakland, and when I asked him about it, he just seemed very reluctant to talk about it. He always wanted to keep things positive, and eventually I realized why he was doing that. I just think that he needs a part of that for himself.
Yeah.
He wants to keep a piece of that to himself, and it's totally understandable. Totally understandable. But as a storyteller, I had to figure out how to work around that, or how to work that into the story.
Yeah.
In a compelling way.
Well, I mentioned earlier that you were a big outliner. That's a thing that you do now. But it seems like this book in particular, having a really rigorous outline would be especially important because it has so many different characters. It has so many different aspects you're working into it. Like one thing we haven't talked about is the fact that you work basketball history into the book. And I think that's really interesting. Was this project daunting to figure out a structure and a shape on for you?
It took me all season to figure that out. Yeah, totally. I was like interviewing all the players, trying to figure out what players I wanted to focus on. And then I was reading up on basketball history. Originally, I was just trying to get to know the sport. I wasn't planning on including any of that in my narrative. But then I was reading about things in basketball history that I felt like resonated with what I was actually seeing on the court while the Dragons were playing. So eventually, I used one to guide the other. I started picking players to focus on based on whether I could find some sort of resonance between them and what I was reading in the history books. So early on, I knew I wanted to do a chapter on Ivan and Paris, on their relationship. But after that, I was just kind of struggling to figure out who else to focus on. And I was also like figuring out how to portray the games too, and how many games to portray was also a trick. It was also a struggle.
Yeah, because I mean, there's even for high school basketball. I mean, I think there's like 30 plus games or something like that. And
yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah, and not only that, but I love the fact that you traveled with the team too. I mean, I don't know, it's kind of funny. It was like there's this one moment at the end and where you actually speak to the team before one of the games. And I thought it was such an interesting thing because after spending so much time with the team, it is like, I don't know, you were a part of the team in your own right. Like you became not like an assistant coach, but like something else. I don't remember what you referred to yourself as when you were trying to get into the locker room. Uh, but
Yeah, I told him I was a team tutor.
the team tutor,
a team tutor.
that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
mean, it's like you really formed, like you became part of the squad in your own way.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I definitely I definitely feel like what they achieved as a unit was definitely apart from me, you
Oh,
know.
sure,
And
sure.
and I didn't go with them to every single one of their games, but I did travel with them a good amount, especially towards the end of the season. And I felt like, especially with Coach Lou and a few of the other players, I got to know them pretty well. Um, I just felt really. I mean, I had no idea that that season would be so epic when I
No.
started following that team. It was kind of a crazy thing. That was something else I was worried about too throughout the whole season. Like, what if this whole thing just ends super quickly, and it's like an anticlimactic ending? But I was just lucky. I just felt really really lucky, and I think Coach Lou especially, his whole thing is about inclusion. You know, I think when he went to Bishop Down in the 1980s, it was stereotyped as like this school for the white kids from the Oakland Hills, for the
Hmm.
rich white kids from the Oakland Hills. And he was one of the few African American kids at that school. And I think that really affected his perspective, so that when he came back as a coach, he wanted to make sure that everybody felt included. So even though like I was this nerdy computer science teacher, and to be honest, like I was intimidated to go into these basketball gyms, you know. But Coach Lou is a very welcoming person, and he did his best to make me feel welcome. And he would ask me, even earlier than I portray in the book, he would ask me, you know, at practices and before games, he'd be like, "Yang man, you have anything to say to the team? You say anything to the team this time?" And at first I'd be like, "No, no, 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 no." And in the end, I did.
Yeah, that was a really great moment. I do have to ask, you mentioned this earlier. Did you find, obviously there's a lot of different ways this could turn out. It is sports is inherently a it's an exercise in great variance. Like even a great team like Bishop O'Dowd can lose to like this random team that they're playing in the preseason that no one would ever in a million years expect them to lose to, like they do in the actual book.
Yeah. Yes.
Did you have contingency plans if
Yes.
like they got knocked out in the first round? You're like, well, this is weird.
Yes. Yes. I totally did. I totally had contingency plans. Yeah. I was building them in my head all the way through
Yeah.
the season. I mean, I had them in my head even during the final game of the season. While I was watching that final game being played, I was like, if this ends poorly, this is what I'm going to do. Yeah, I totally did. I was gonna, yeah, it was gonna be a portrait of, it would be a portrait of continuing through disappointment. I think
Sure.
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean that type of stuff. I mean that's it. Really, in some ways, it does make it feel a little bit more like you were. It's not like you were reporting on it. Reporting on it makes it feel very dry, which is not true. It's a very personal story, but it's also you like tap into the immensely personal nature of competition for all these people. But there was like the reporter like element. I will say one thing that I did notice that I thought was really interesting was how you lettered yourself different than everyone else. It in and of itself almost had like a reporter look to it. It was like it almost felt like a typewriter type font. Why did you do that? Was that something that you just knew you wanted to separate yourself from everybody else subconsciously through the lettering choice?
Yeah, I think I wanted my voice to be there even when I was talking about history, because I felt I was a little bit worried about delving into the history and it feeling like it was disconnected from everything else.
Sure.
So I wanted you to get used to my voice and then have my voice narrate those history parts and then bring you back out into the present day.
Well, and you would need a different font choice to be able to like separate and say this is Gene. This is Gene speaking.
That's right. That's right. This is me speaking. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about the history stuff, but why did you? I am, as I said earlier, a massive basketball fan, and I've read books on basketball, and I've followed basketball since I was like 5 years old, and I learned a lot about basketball history from this. I was especially Sandra Berenson and like the original, like the way that women's basketball worked, which looking at it now is insane. Like just absolutely bonkers to like read about how like it was separated into zones and how they had to make sure that it was like different than men's basketball and everything like that. Why was that something that you decided that you wanted to include? Was it a desire to make it a bit more inclusive in case somebody them didn't actually know basketball very well?
Well, I was reading basketball books, like books about basketball history
Sure.
specifically, as I was following the team, just to get to know the sport. I wasn't planning on including any of that in the book, but I just found it so crazy. Like
Yeah.
Sandra Madison, like you were saying, and then even how basketball itself was invented, I found fascinating. I started seeing these connections between players on this team and stuff that I was reading about. I mean, the obvious one is Alex Zhao, who was a foreign exchange student from China who was
Hmm.
on Coach Lu's team. And when I talked to him about what brought him into basketball, how he became interested in basketball, so much of it was tied into Yao Ming. So I
Right.
started looking into the history of basketball in China, and I just thought, man, a lot of this really needs to be here because it plays into how he got to Bishop O'Dowd. And I think even with Jeevan Sandhu, who is a Sikh player, one of the only Sikh players in the league, who was playing on that team as well. The way he eventually got to Bishop O'Dowd, this Catholic school, was because of this long history that basketball and Catholic schools share.
I love how you use the history to connect to like the individual stories because like you talked about Alex and Yao Ming, and then there was also like the I mentioned Sandra Berenson. Like, oh man, I'm gonna completely mess up their names. It's Arins and how do
Oh,
you?
Odera and Arinze. Yeah,
Yeah, Rinze. Yeah, like connecting that story to theirs and everything like that. And I don't know, it's funny because their relationship reminds me of my favorite basketball player ever is Reggie Miller. And Reggie Miller,
yeah, yeah.
he has like the hilarious thing. Like everyone will always be like Reggie Miller was a great player, but not nearly as good as his sister because she is what some would say the greatest women's basketball player that's ever lived. And it's really fun like seeing that combination but also seeing how you use that history to build context and like give us a little framework going into it, not that they're actively thinking about Sandra Berenson when they play each other in their driveway or anything like that, but it's a part of it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, what happened in the past with Berenson and even with Georgianne Wells
Oh
affects
yeah.
Arinze and Adara's relationship. Even if they're not aware of it, it totally affects it.
One of my favorite notes from the history of basketball is in the actual notes section at the end of the book, where you comment on the fact that no one can decide if it's a Canadian sport or American sport, which is completely accurate. I think it's just such a
Yeah,
weird thing.
yeah, it totally is. It totally is.
Well, so I did want to talk about like we've talked about how there's chapters focusing on like Odera and Arinze, and then there's Ivan and Paris, and all these different characters. You have this individual focus. Sometimes it's on the games, other times it's on the players themselves. Why was that something you wanted to do? Why did that kind of just spawn from the fact that there was some players that had perhaps more interesting narratives, or was it something you went in wanting to do?
So I was reading a lot of different books to to kind of just get an idea of how I wanted to structure my book. I read Friday Night Lights. I watched the movie. I watched the TV series.
Hmm.
I read another book called The Last Shot, which is about Steph Marbury when he was a kid.
Hmm.
Another one called Skyline, which is about an Oakland team in the '80s. And I also like was trying to figure out how people tell sports stories for non-sports fans. So I looked at how the Olympics coverage works, and there's a lot of focus on the individual.
Hmm.
So pretty early on, I knew I had to pick a few players to focus on. I was thinking about three or four, but I ended up having I think six or seven, right? Because there's so many interesting stories on that team. I'm sure that if I wanted to, I could do a graphic novel on every single kid on that team because they all
Right.
had incredibly interesting stories. But there's a balance between how their stories resonated with these stories from basketball history that I was
Hmm.
reading, and there was also a balance of like how open they wanted to be, with this nerdy graphic novel guy. So in the end, I landed on those six. Some of those kids I'm still in touch with. I'm still in touch with Jimin. I'm still in touch with Arinze, and Coach Luen and I text each other all the time. So a lot of that led to long-lasting relationships, which I'm really grateful for.
I have to say, I think my favorite chapter might have been Alex, and seeing like his story is really interesting because it speaks so much to like how different the sport can be regionally. Like he when he first came to America, he was playing. I think it was on the East Coast, right? And he was just like, I
Yeah,
am so much better than all these guys. And then he transfers to a
yeah,
different school, and he's like, I am so much worse than all these guys.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it
yeah. That's
really,
right.
the location changes so much. I just thought his story and about how like the bravery he showed in leaving his country to go and try and become great at what he does and trying to like challenge himself for the best. I'm a big baseball fan too. And I always think it's really interesting when, for example, like the Japanese Baseball League is one of the best leagues in the world, but so many players leave there for Major League Baseball because they want to challenge themselves against the best. They won't, they feel like they'd be doing themselves a disservice if they just continued to like beat up on players that they thought they were just much better than. And to see Alex doing that and see him and how he like improved, like I loved it when his 3-point shot developed and all of a sudden he was like an integral part of the team. Like it was just really cool seeing his narrative play out.
Yeah, it was cool to see it in real life too. He really did become a fan favorite, especially at that last game of the season. People were cheering his name from the stands. It was great to hear.
Yeah.
And I just, when I was interviewing him and he was telling me how he eventually got to Bishop Dad, I was astounded. He made the decision to come to America essentially by himself when he was like
Yeah.
14 years old.
Yeah.
And I was shocked. I was shocked that a kid that young could have that kind of vision for his life. And ultimately, now he is Coach Luen and he are still in touch,
Hmm.
and he's about to graduate from Penn State. He was there for a couple years, and then he took some time off, and he did get to play professional basketball. I think he played in Malaysia for a season or two, and then decided to come back to graduate. So he achieved something. He had wanted to play basketball professionally somewhere in the world, and he was able to do it.
Yeah. I was astonished because when I was 14 and about to go into high school, I was horrified about the mere act of going to a different school. He went to a different country
Yeah,
and a different school. I'm
yeah,
like, wow.
yeah.
Well, one of my favorite parts about the book that I thought was really like interesting was you had this engagement with Jeevan about his hairline in the book. And it was this really great moment where so you had apparently been sharing sketches on Tumblr of the kids, and maybe it was connected to the announcement of the book or something like that. But Jeevan saw it, and he was just like, "Oh, that's not how my hair looks exactly." And I loved how you played with the form. You were live adjusting looks in the comic itself to adjust his hair to get it right. Why was that something you wanted to do, to like play with the form like that? Because it ended up being such like a charming, memorable moment in the book.
Well, one of the things that I struggled with was
Likenesses.
that there. Well, definitely likenesses, and there's this balance between the likenesses, like human faces. If you like, I think an alien coming to Earth would probably have a hard time telling the difference between most humans because most
Sure.
of us look like we have the same parts in roughly the same places, right, on our faces. So when you are creating cartoon characters in a comic, you want them to be distinguishable. So that combined with the fact that I'm not a very strong caricaturist made it so that my characters are going to look different from how they look in real life, right?
Hmm.
So for each character, I had to decide what's the most important thing that I want to convey about this character. And for Jimin, I wanted to make sure that he read as Punjabi
Hmm.
and not as African American, because I felt like that was such an important part of his story. But you could tell that immediately when you look at him. But if you were to cartoon him with his hair in a more accurate way, I think his cartoon version would look more African American than Punjabi, simply because of the way he kept it cut. So that was something that I kind of struggled with. I was like trying to figure out a solution for that. And ultimately, I decided to include that in the book, in part to sort of remind the reader that this is, this is a cartoon version of real people, and there's going to be this difference between how I draw them and how they appear in real life.
It was so fun seeing how you adjusted his hair, and it was just kind of like, I don't know, there was this like interesting push-pull tension between the creation and reality it was just so fascinating to see. I don't know, I love things like that.
Well, thanks. Thank you. Now that I think about it, I think it was also a suggestion from the Story Trust. So within First Second Books, there's a group of cartoonists who we get together on Google Chat every so often, and we critique each other. And I think it may have come out of one of those, the suggestion to do something like that.
I think I read about that. I just had Jen Wang on the podcast, and we talked about stargazing. Yeah. And if I remember correctly, like that was something that she like was interacting with to like try to figure some of that stuff out. Because that's the thing is creating comics can be a very isolationist activity, and it's always really good to have a very trusty group of people to be able to, give honest feedback without like trying to like change the book entirely. And it seems like that'd be really valuable.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I think when you're drawing, this is what I found. Sometimes when I'm drawing, I can't see the mistakes that I'm making unless I look at a mirror image of the drawing. And then I'll be able to see some of the proportion mistakes that I'm making. But you can't really do that with writing, right? There's no way to look at a mirror image of your own writing. So you need a good editor or a good writing group to tell you where weaknesses are.
Related to the Jeevan stuff, though, I do think that it underlines something I thought was really interesting about creating that was like 2015 probably, but like even now it's probably even more. It's even more than that because we're in an era where we're sharing stuff live, we're sharing things into the world as it's happening, the development, people can see things like this. But the interesting thing about yours is these were real people, and these were young people who are going to see your stuff on Tumblr because A, it's them, and B, it's Tumblr, so they were probably all about it. Were the kids ever self-conscious about the project during its development, and did you find that ever impacted how you approached it at all?
Yeah, I have to tell you, I think it was hard to tell. I actually think that what I found with athletes, at least with the athletes on this particular team, is that they tried, and I think it was Coach Lou's example. They always tried to maintain a positive and an open stance, to people who visited them, to people who supported them. To media, even to like adversity, the adversity that would hit them on the court. They would always try to be positive and they would try to be open. So I felt like a lot of times it was up to me to figure out where they were uncomfortable,
where the line is,
and not push past it. And sometimes I felt guilty about not pushing past it. I was like, if I were a journalist, I would try to push past this, but I don't think I can. So I think there was some of that, but ultimately, I think they were able to give me enough to propel the narrative forward, which is what all that I was looking for.
Well, and also I think for a lot of young athletes, I mean, I'm not saying that every single person on that Bishop O'Dowd team had aspirations to be in the NBA or something like that. A great example is, oh my God, I'm completely forgetting the name of the player towards the end who knew that he didn't want to play in college and go past that.
Oh, Austin. Yeah.
Austin. Yeah. Not everyone on the team had aspirations for going to the NBA or anything like that. But for somebody like Ivan, for example, somebody who was without a doubt one of the top players in the country and who he was ended up playing at Cal, and then he ended up being drafted in the NBA and everything like that. In a weird way, being interviewed like that is just kind of part of the process for them. It's like you were providing them on the job training for their hopeful future job in some ways.
Yeah. Ivan and Paris both were being interviewed all the time
Oh yeah.
by the media. Yeah, like there were YouTube channels that were doing features on them. Local newspapers were doing features on them, and then we played on a televised game, televised on ESPN. ESPN reporters were talking to them, so
Hmm.
they're very used to talking to the media.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, in regards to that line, you said that there was like that line you didn't know if you should push past it and stuff. One of the you mentioned this earlier. One of the points of tension in the story comes from whether or not you wanted to how you wanted to frame the story of the former coach Phelps. At first it seemed like you didn't want to get into it, and it was always kind of a thread throughout. Was I guess like one of the things I'm interested in terms of like the creative process is like even halfway through, did you know that it was going to happen in the end? Or was that something that really like it wouldn't have come up if it weren't for the way that the story played out?
I struggled with that all the way through the season. All the way, actually, I mean, I had a contingency plan in my head towards like even as late as I don't know a year and a half ago. I was still thinking maybe I should pull all that stuff out, all the stuff about Coach Phelps out,
Hmm.
because it's such a painful and really unclear part of the history of that team. I ended up going over to Coach Lue's house one night, and we just sat there and talked about it. Like I think he had a game on. We were both sitting there. We weren't really watching the game. We were just talking about Coach Phelps and what I should do about him and the narrative, and ultimately he told me you should just do what you think is right as a storyteller, and I ended up including it. But it was I mean that's just it's like one of the most painful subjects to talk about, right? And I felt like overall I wanted the team the book to be about the players. I wanted it to be about the sport, and I didn't want the muddiness around Coach Phelps and his reputation to tarnish that. But I was worried that like the tension was if I include it in the narrative, it'll overwhelm everything else. And if I don't include it in the narrative, people who know about basketball, know about the team, and know about Coach Phelps, it's going to taint it
Right.
regardless. Like the absence of it will taint it. Because within California basketball, he's pretty well known.
Yeah. I mean, he was the all-time leader in wins, right? Until a certain point in that book itself, he got surpassed by, I think, one of the other coaches. Was that the Mater D team? But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing is like there's this real push-pull about it because yes, Coach Phelps is an essential part of the history of Bishop O'Dowd, but this isn't about the history of Bishop O'Dowd necessarily. This is really about this team and what they were going through. And it was interesting. Like, I mean, it makes sense that like the final moment that convinces you to include it makes sense in the end as to why you would include it. Because if you didn't, you wouldn't have the context for why it mattered so much. But it is so interesting because it's like, I'm not saying it's remotely the same, but I've come across I've written articles for my site where I'm unsure if I want to include something because it feels like people are gonna wonder why I didn't include it if I don't. But really, it's not relevant to the subject, and so if I do include it, it sort of feels forced. It's kind of there's a tension there, and it's really tricky.
Yeah, it was sort of like that. It was absolutely like that. That's the feeling that I was having.
Just a few more questions. I touted this on Twitter. The book design, the final product is maybe my favorite graphic novel production I have ever experienced. I mean, it is remarkably done. It looks and feels like a basketball, which is a heck of a thing. Kirk Benshoff did the design. How did
He
that come?
did.
Yeah, I mean, how did that come together? Was that something you were like, I'd like this, or is it just Kirk being like, I got you, and then he does that?
It was mostly him, man. It was mostly him. He came up with a couple of designs. We had a back and forth. My agent Judy Hansen got involved as well. Judy is also Raina Telgemeyer's agent and Kazu Kubuyushi's agent, Scott McCloud's agent. She actually has a lot of wisdom about covers as well.
Sure.
But out of all that, out of these long conversations, Kirk comes up with this amazing design. I'm shocked at the work he's done on it. When I got the physical copy of the final product through the mail and I opened it up, I was taken aback by his work.
Yeah. I received an advanced copy of it before it was like the final one, and I was like, I'm really excited to read this, but I'm gonna give it a minute before I do it. And then I got like the actual book. I'm like, I have to read this right now because it's like so nice. And it's funny how
It's
that
so nice.
it's funny how things like that affect you. It's like I don't know, it made it so much more inviting just having that level of production to it. But
Yeah. Just the way it feels too, right? I'm shocked that they were able to do that. That First Second Books was able to get the texture of a basketball on a book jacket.
yeah, it's incredible. Well, so to close, I want to talk about some stuff generally related to what you learned in the process. And naturally, I have to start with, like as I said, the book starts with you talking about how you were not overly fond of basketball, or like it just really isn't a thing for you. Do you find that going through this process and spending all that time with the team made you appreciate not just sports, but the narrative and drama of sports more?
Yes. I think the big difference between superhero comics, which is the dominant narrative that I grew up with, and sports is that you are not sure who's going to win at the end with sports. Even if you have the greatest players on the greatest team, you could still lose to the worst team in the league on any given night. There are upsets all the time, and I think there's a risk to that. I just think that's what I learned that season is that sometimes you just have to man up to the risk and take a step forward. You just got to do it.
That was one of my favorite recurring things that you did in the story, actually, was there's this one shot you used over and over for all of the individual stories, and it was each of the individuals standing on the sidewalk outside Bishop O'Dowd and taking that first step. And it was a really nice, it was a really nice moment showing like these people are taking a step to doing something special or something different for themselves. Like, Lou, you were showing him when he was younger and when Bishop O'Dowd was a primarily white school, and like him getting in there and like pushing himself to try to become a great basketball player. And it was really cool seeing that physical manifestation in the book of them taking that step. It was really nice.
Well, it was something that I read about over and over again in basketball history, and then I heard in the stories of the players.
Yeah. Well, I tying into all this though, I mean, I do think we talked about this before we started recording. It's a very interesting time to have this conversation because on Sunday, like one of the biggest icons in the history of basketball, Kobe Bryant, tragically passed away, and I do think that the thing that's really interesting about athletes is like Superman or like Batman or like Spider-Man or something like, or any number of superheroes. It's like somebody like Kobe Bryant, who's like an icon. He's not just an athlete. It's like those people, they live on forever in a way that is very similar to the fictional characters you and I both love. Did you find that there was an appeal to you as a storyteller about that kind of thing as well?
Yeah, the Kobe Bryant death was shocking to me. I heard about it through a text from a friend of mine, a friend named Tin, who had actually come with me to some of the Bishop O'Dowd games. I didn't put him in the book, but he did sit next to me on the bleachers as I watched the games. He's like of all my college friends, he's the one that loved basketball the most.
Was he one of the 950 crew that would watch the highlights?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. And I invited him with me to see some of the games so that he could explain to me what was going on. He texted me that Kobe Bryant had died, and it was a shock. It was a shock, especially finding out that his daughter had passed away with him too. I have 3 daughters, and it's something that I can't imagine. And I think the interesting thing about Kobe Bryant is that I was not a basketball fan during his career, but I wasn't just aware of his name. I knew his personality, like never watched him. I've never really watched him play, but he was such a presence that I knew his personality. I knew that he was driven and that he was tenacious and that he was uncompromising and that people, and then he was fearless, and that people loved him for it. So I think that just points to the reach that sports can have, or that narrative in general can have. And I think what you're saying is exactly right. In the same way that, um, we can actually have an argument, like a meaningful argument about what is in and out of character for Batman. We could do the same thing for Kobe Bryant. We know what's in and out of character for him
Yeah.
because his story and his legend had gotten so big. It had inspired so many people.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things about sports and the comics crossover again, it's like you look at like famous Superman stories and you can point, you're like, oh, do you remember that time that, he beat Lex Luthor by doing this or something like that? But you also look at athletes' careers, like, a good example of a team that ended up losing in tragic fashion is in your very own back door. It's like the Golden State Warriors. They had this 73 win season. I think the year
Yep,
after you followed the team, and
that's right.
and they went to the finals and they were up 3-1 on the severely underdog Cleveland Cavaliers, and the Cavaliers came back and won. And it's interesting because like both of those moments, it's like it's kind of like a sliding doors like bifurcation moment in like the history and narratives of all of these players. Like that moment will forever, I mean, like LeBron was gonna be somebody people are gonna remember forever, but it immortalized him as this person that came back from 3-1. It was the David versus Goliath
Yeah,
thing. And
that's
like
right.
for Steph Curry and everybody else, it was this moment where it was like this great tragedy in their careers. How do they come back from it? And it's really fascinating how moments like that manifest themselves in like the broader psyche of society. I don't know. I always find that stuff to be really interesting.
Yeah, that was a sad season. I got to tell you, for people in the Bay Area, that was rough. That was a rough way to end that season. And I don't know if you remember this too. There's a game during that season, during that '73 season, where that totally proves the point that you can never predict, um, who's going to win. Because one of those losses that Golden State had was to the Lakers, who were at the very bottom of the barrel at
Yep.
the time. So the topmost team lost to the bottommost team in the NBA during that season. And it was
Yeah.
like the topmost team ever at the time, right? Like
They won the
they were on
most
track.
regular season games
Yep.
ever.
Yeah. And one of the losses was to the worst team in the league.
It's so weird how that
So you never know.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You never know with sports.
Well, the last question I have is, this. I find this book to be really interesting in a number of ways because it was like you were kind of pushing back against yourself in some ways. It was you tackling a subject that you were not inherently interested in. It was you doing autobio comics, which was something you hadn't really done in the past, and it was you basically forcing yourself to live a life where you were, basically embedded with this team in a lot of ways. Did you find that you learned a lot about yourself and also storytelling and maybe even where where stories can come from while doing this, while putting together Dragon Hoops?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that I'd heard this advice, and it's advice that I give to my own students. I teach at Hamlin University through their MFA program, so I teach creative writing to people who are interested in writing for young people. And the advice that I heard, the advice that I give is that you should always chase after the idea that scares you the most.
Mm.
And I think with Dragon Hoops, I really felt the wisdom of that advice. I think that's the best way to push yourself as a creative person is to chase after the idea that scares you the most. I also think on a practical level, I wonder. I was so scared about leaving Bishop O'Dowd, even with an amazing offer like the one I got from DC Comics to write Superman. I don't know if I would have left had I not been following the team that season. Had I not learned the lessons that I had learned as I was watching these kids play. I mean, one of the moments that still sticks out to me. It's a moment. It's a small moment in the book, but it's one where Elijah Hardy, who's a freshman on the team, he's like 14 years old. He's on
Yeah.
this televised team against Ben Simmons' team in Florida. It's on ESPN. This 14-year-old kid takes a shot over a kid that's much taller than him, and he makes it. And I just thought, man, how does he do that? I think about myself at 14. I was a mess, and he had the presence of mind to be able to do that. on national TV, on a court full of mostly kids that are 2 or 3 years older than him, that are much bigger than him. I think I was inspired by that sort of courage that I saw.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's, in the stories of people like Alex and Arinze and everyone else, I mean, or like Jeevan, like that was one of the things I thought was really interesting that you covered is that I think that most people don't think of what, a Punjabi student like Jeevan would go through when he's on a traveling team, when he's going around the country to play these people, or even just when he's in California. But the bravery and the courage it takes to go out there and perform despite like people being actively against you, not just in the sense that their basketball team is playing your team, but against the fact that they're actively against you as who you are, basically. And that kind of courage, I mean, it's really, I mean, that's why I love sports stories. I find it to be really inspiring. I find stories like that to be so inspiring to like keep pushing even when it feels like it might be too much, Yeah,
that's right. That's right. I think that's why we rely on superhero stories, and that's why we rely on stories of athletes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Gene, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Dragon Hoops and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you for reading the book, and thanks for inviting me on. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Gene Luen Yang. You can find him on Twitter at Gene Luen Yang, on his website at geneyang.com, and in the upcoming Dragon Hoops, which arrives on March 17th. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all the site's content and its members only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, following on Twitter at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Harley Orr, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachala, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzzbubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Harry Sayer, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slates, Litwin Studios, Akil Wilson, Nathan House, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Leona Kingus, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwan, Connor Farner, Vita Yala, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Xavier Files, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Chipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Carissa Holleran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.